Thank you for viewing this presentation, brought to you by the World Affairs Council of the Monterey Bay Area. My name is Glenn Robinson. I'm the president of the World Affairs Council here, as well as a professor at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we are not able to currently hold our monthly luncheons, which feature talks by experts on international affairs. In their place, we have developed a video series entitled Issues Around the World in the Age of COVID-19. We have lined up many experts from the Naval Postgraduate School, the Middlebury Institute, and the Naval War College unit at NPS to provide quick takes that analyze important international issues. These 15-minute or so lectures will be distributed twice a month on the 15th and 30th, and will also be posted on our website. You can see the URL on your screen now. If you would like to sign up for automatic distribution of these short lectures, please email us at the email address that you see on your screen, the redshift.com email address to sign up. In addition to the lectures themselves, we are offering the opportunity to participate in a moderated discussion after each lecture. If there is sufficient interest, a moderated discussion of today's lecture on Global Jihad will be held online in about a week's time. If you're interested in participating in this online discussion, please email us to let us know. If there is sufficient interest, we will email out the details to those who signed up. We are pleased to be able to continue to provide important educational content to our community during these difficult times, and we welcome your feedback. And so, without further ado, I would like to give you a quick take on understanding the phenomenon of global jihad, a movement that first emerged in Afghanistan in the 1980s and later produced infamous groups such as Al-Qaeda, and ISIS. I'd like to give you two important ways to think about this movement of global jihad. And for those of you that see the background behind me, you'll see my book cover. I have a book coming out entitled Global Jihad, A Brief History from Stanford University Press. It's coming out in November. And so if you are interested in the topic from this quick take today, feel free to read the book later this fall, where you get all the details. But two basic arguments. The first argument is that there have been four very distinct waves or iterations of global jihad over the past 40 years, really, again, beginning in the 1980s. Each of those iterations or waves had its own crisis, emerged out of its own crisis, both a specific crisis that was then manifested as a broader crisis throughout the region, the Middle East, or even the broader Islamic world. And each had a very distinct and different ideological answer to that crisis. So while each of these four waves, all the groups and people I'm talking about, all share fundamental characteristics about engaging in global jihad, they also had quite distinctive ideological problems and ideological solutions. So I'll spend the first few minutes in today's quick take lecture going over those differences between the four waves, what each wave was about, including the fourth wave that we are currently in and will continue to be in for years to come. And the second argument that I'll make today is that global jihad should be seen as an example of a movement of rage. These movements are seen across cultures, across political ideologies, all in recent times, all in the last century or so. And so it links together these violent anti-Enlightenment groups, such as the Khmer Rouge, the Brown Shirts, were part of the Nazi coalition in the 1930s, the Red Guards of Maoist China in the mid-1960s, and elements of white nationalism or white supremacism today. So those are the two things I want to do today, is outline the four quite distinctive waves that you've seen of global jihad, and then situate it in the broader universe of violent political movements. All right, so the four waves. The first wave really begins in, if you will, in December of 1979 with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And throughout the 1980s, not just the invasion, but the occupation of the Muslim lands of Afghanistan. one of the great, perhaps the great popularizer and mobilizer of people from around the Muslim world to come and fight was a fellow by the name of Abdullah Azzam, a Palestinian that grew up in Jordan, and came to Afghanistan, Pakistan and Afghanistan early on after the Soviets invaded. His picture there is in the upper right-hand corner in good Pakistani Afghan mountain garb. He was prolific in his writing. He also traveled around the world. He came to the United States on at least a couple of occasions to build awareness and fundraise for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan fighting the Soviet Union. He developed a theory over time, and particularly late in his life, and in the last year, he was assassinated in 1989 after the Soviets had withdrawn. But he developed this theory of the systemic problem facing the Muslim world is so many of their historic lands are occupied by infidel foreign powers. So basically taking the Afghan model of Soviet occupation of Muslim Afghanistan and applying it to the broader world. So he would see, occupied Muslim lands in Palestine, in Kashmir, in Central Asia, at that time under the Soviet Union, Mindanao in the Philippines, and elsewhere. And he developed this notion that was very similar. He called it al-Qaida al-Sulba, the solid base. It's very similar to the old notion that many of you will know of the Communist International, which was developed primarily in the 19-teens and 1920s, and had as its idea of dedicated communists that would travel the world, primarily the European world at the time, and assist local communities in promoting revolution and thereby liberating themselves, in this case, from bourgeois occupation. Abdullah Azzam had the same notion, but instead of problems in capitalism, it was problems of occupied Muslim territory. So let's build a jihadi international of solid warriors of Islam that would go around the world and work with local Muslim communities to liberate occupied lands. Again, lands that were historically Muslim, ruled historically under Islam, but really over the last 2 or 3 centuries had been conquered by other powers. So liberating occupied Muslim lands became the first wave. It never got practiced much outside of Afghanistan. Abdullah Azzam was assassinated in 1989. His idea, however, was brought to the Saudi royal family after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in August of 1990. And bin Laden presented this idea to the royal family and said, I can raise 100,000 warriors, 100,000 mujahideen from around the Arab world, and we can liberate Kuwait that way. Don't bring in the infidel Americans and their allies. Let us do in Kuwait what we did in Afghanistan. The Saudis, of course, rejected that offer. This was on the path of radicalization of Osama bin Laden. This was a fairly major milestone. With the death of Abdullah Azzam and the rejection of his idea presented by bin Laden to the Saudis in 1990, basically global jihad as an organized movement essentially went away for a few years. But by the mid-1990s, it was back. And the second wave of global jihad was led infamously by Osama bin Laden and his newly minted or newly reformed group of al-Qaeda. Now, the first wave focused, their major crisis was the occupation of Muslim lands around the world. For bin Laden, the major crisis was the durability of what he viewed as apostate regimes, anti-Islamic regimes throughout the Middle East. He viewed the rise of Islamism and jihadism in the 1970s, 1980s. It was victorious in so many places, but by the early to mid-1990s, it was starting to fail. It was starting to be reversed, most notably in Egypt and Algeria, two large important Arab countries, where in 1990 you would have thought these regimes were maybe on their last legs, by 1995, they had effectively defeated the insurgencies against them, a low-intensity conflict in Egypt, a hot civil war in Algeria. By 1997, the conflicts were formally over. Bin Laden couldn't understand this unless these local regimes had something else going for them, because they've appeared very weak, whether it was Saudi Arabia or Egypt or others. They should be able to be overthrown, but they weren't. And this is where he came up with this notion of America first. It's like those old Bobo dolls that you punch and they fall over, but they pop right back up because of that weight in the bottom of the Bobo doll. Well, that weight was a far enemy, was the United States, that was propping up these local regimes, making them more powerful than they should be by right. So if you attack the Americans, drive them out of the Middle East, the local regimes, again, in Saudi and Egypt and elsewhere, would become much more vulnerable to jihadi overthrow. And that's the basis. That was the crisis that led to the second wave of global jihad. Its apex was fairly short, 1998 to 2001. 1998 is when the American embassies in East Africa, in Kenya and Tanzania, were bombed, killing a lot of Africans and a few Americans. And of course, the apex from their point of view, the nadir from mine, the September 11th, 2001 terror attacks in the United States. Al-Qaeda Central, as it came to be called, the organization based in the Afghanistan-Pakistan border area, fairly quickly was defeated in the aftermath of the late 2001 U.S. coalition invasion of Afghanistan, and putting Al-Qaeda and bin Laden on the run. A lot of jihadis were killed. Bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri did survive, at least for a while in the case of bin Laden. But the organization itself just became a hollow shell fairly quickly, certainly by 2003 or so. I date the end of the second wave to 2011 when bin Laden was killed by American Navy SEALs in Abbottabad, Pakistan. There is still an Al-Qaeda central organization under Ayman al-Zawahiri, but it is quite meager, it's quite weak, certainly by comparison to ISIS. And that is the third wave, the ISIS wave, what I call the Caliphate Now wave, which begins in Iraq with the U.S. invasion in 2003, the overthrow of the Saddam Hussein regime, and the sort of chaos that ensued allowed jihadis that were basically engaged in fairly radical thought. There's a lot of literature from the 2003-2005 time period. Some of the most radical of all the jihadi manuscripts were produced during this period of time. And that focus, the focus of the arguments there really were twofold. The most important thing for the jihadis in Iraq and some of their allies from around particularly the Arab world, was not the apostate regimes per se, but apostasy itself. And so the solution was, and this is the second part, the state build, to build a state in the heart of the Middle East where apostasy itself would not be practiced. So a pure, puritanical Islamic state in the heartland of the Middle East that could grow out over time to historical Muslim borders and who knows, perhaps beyond. So the focus was on territory, not occupation of occupied lands or liberation of occupied lands, not overthrowing these local, near enemy apostate regimes, but in creating a state, an Islamic state, at least their version of an Islamic state, in which apostasy itself would be gotten rid of, and so Muslims could live a pious life to their fullest. I date the end of this experiment, this ISIS state, to 2017. What happened in 2017? Basically, their territory went away. Their primary cities of Mosul in Iraq and Raqqa in Syria were overrun. And the territorial caliphate of ISIS went away. Now, that doesn't mean ISIS is gone. ISIS as a jihadi group, as opposed to a territorial state, but as a jihadi group, is still around. It's the largest jihadi group in the world. Craig Whiteside will be talking in a couple of weeks' time about what remains of ISIS and basically a very deadly remnant of it. But what set it apart, what made it different, that territorial state was over by 2017. And so, therefore, I suggest the third wave of global jihad ended at that point. At almost the same time, but for very different reasons and very different causes, a fourth wave, the wave that we're currently in, and I think we will be in for quite some time, was born, a wave of personal jihad, of individual jihad, that began with the overthrow of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan in 2001, and basically the next few years, these jihadis were very much on the run. And so it came to a Syrian fellow in the lower left-hand picture there, a fellow by the name of Abu Musab al-Suri. He was from Aleppo, Syria originally. He was a red-headed fellow. To come up with a strategy of how global jihad can survive. How can it live to fight another day in the 21st century, given the technology of the 21st century? And since it is, excuse me, it is the current wave that we are in right now, I'd like to spend just a couple more minutes talking about that before we move over to movements of rage. So again, the specific crisis that got Abu Musab al-Suri thinking and writing, he was a very prolific writer anyway, was the loss of what they called the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. And then I would suggest after that, although Abu Musab al-Suri hasn't been heard from since 2005, the loss of the caliphate, the ISIS caliphate, and of course the death of many jihadis. So the same kind of question arises. How can, given these circumstances, how can global jihad survive in the 21st century? What is the right strategy to adopt? And so this is what Abu Musab al-Suri did over 1,600 pages in this internet book. You see a picture of its cover on your screen right now. Da'wat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya al-Alamiyya, the call for global Islamic resistance. And this strategy had a number of characteristics. It was based on this notion, first and foremost, of jihad fardi, of personal jihad, that it wasn't up to organizations and large groups of people. It was up to individuals and small groups of people to keep hope alive, to keep undertaking violence, keep promoting global jihad. It was a time of personal jihad, not large, open battlefield kind of warfare. So personal jihad is a cornerstone of this strategy. He emphasized networks, not organizations. He said, look, at organizations, he looked around the Middle East, and jihadi organizations could be rolled up so easily by state security forces. They capture one or two guys, torture them, they give up the names of everybody else, or at least a bunch of others, they capture them, torture them, they give up more names, and the group gets rolled up very, very quickly, very easily, and these groups never amounted to very much. They might, kill somebody now and again, but they didn't affect serious political change. So he said, look, we need a system. And his system was based on networks, not organizations. So this famous line in his book, Nizam la Tanzim, a system, not an organization. So the system, which again was a system of networks, which are much more difficult to roll up by security forces. He emphasized the importance of gore. He was a fan of Frantz Fanon's writing, The Wretched of the Earth, and which also emphasized the almost a cleansing notion of killing your oppressor with your own hands and the blood and guts that came with it. So that kind of blood and guts was important, and particularly on civilian targets for Abu Musab al-Suri, who has been implicated, for example, in helping to plan the Madrid train attacks that killed almost 200 civilians, the 7/7 attacks in London that again killed dozens of civilians. So he emphasized the notion of gore, the importance of blood and guts, essentially. He was media savvy. He noted that any individual small group that was going to undertake a personal jihad, an action, an act of violence, make sure the world knows why you're doing it. You know, phone in 911 as the Orlando murderer did. Leave behind a video, but make sure the world knows that you are doing this in the name of global jihad, whether some group or just the idea, but that this is in the name of global jihad. And don't be dependent on individual leaders. Again, leaders can be killed. Leaders can be killed, so that, you know, the charismatic leader that we see at the center of so many of these groups, for Abu Musab al-Suri was not so important. What was important, and this is my phrase, not his, but the creation of a wiki narrative that the group, the universe of jihadis build, again, using 21st century technologies, the internet, social media, can build an ideology, build a narrative of what they do and why they do it, and new acts of violence can be incorporated into that narrative, and it can morph a little bit, although, you know, the basics remain the same. And it's that communal wiki narrative that can maintain the jihadi community and make its actions, these sort of small pinprick acts of violence, be woven together into a broader, more powerful narrative, more powerful than the actual actions themselves. So that is the fourth wave, and there's no end date on this one, as there are in the first three, simply because we're still in it. And I think you will continue to see this. It's a pretty effective strategy for the realities of the 21st century. It is not an existential threat. It's not even a very major strategic threat, but it is what I call a deadly nuisance. It'll kill people, and I think that will continue for years to come. All right, so let me turn to the second, just briefly, the second argument that I'd like to make in this quick take, and that is to understand global jihad in the universe, kind of where it fits in the universe of violent political movements over the last century or so. And here I use this notion that first originated with Ken Jowett, who was at Berkeley for many years, although I tweak it and fine tune it a bit. But this notion of a movement of rage, these movements from the margins of modernity, people that are not country bumpkins, ill-educated, what have you. They tend to be very well-educated individuals, but still from the margins, from peripheral cities, peripheral schools, not fully embraced by these sort of modern, the modernization of going on in their countries. So these are groups that adopt anti-Enlightenment ideals. Now, again, you think about almost all movements, political movements of the last couple of centuries, whether they're liberal nationalist, national liberation, communist, or fascist, I mean, across the political spectrum, these are all movements that promise some form of enlightenment, and that is some form of progress, liberty, freedom, liberation, what have you. And that includes, as I said, that would include even fascism, which in Mussolini's famous term was about making the trains run on time, which is, again, it's an Enlightenment ideal of progress. So the vast majority of these movements that we've seen, political movements that use violence, have still been based on at least various parts of the Enlightenment, set of Enlightenment ideals. Movements of rage are not, they're anti-Enlightenment. They engage in nihilistic violence, that is root and branch. This is nihilism in the political sense, not the philosophical sense. Root and branch violence, that the whole system needs to be destroyed, not strategic violence for a particular purpose, but just get rid of everything that is part of that system. I coined this term nocicide to get at part of that that nihilistic approach, and that is attacks on the educated, attacks on education. Modern knowledge is something to be shunned, not embraced. So, for example, with the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, who was number one target? Who was public enemy number one? Was the educated. People that could speak a European language, people that wore a coat and tie or wore glasses that showed that they were educated. These are the people that were slaughtered outright or sent out to the countryside to die in the killing fields. Or the Red Guards in China in the mid-1960s. Who did they target? They targeted high school and college graduates that basically were embodied cultural corruption, as a term that they use, a phrase that they use. And these were people that in some cases were killed outright, but by the millions were sent out in the countryside, where again, many died from starvation out in the countryside. Book burning by the Nazis, of course, a famous example of nocicide. In addition to the nihilistic violence, movements of rage adopt an apocalyptic ideology. This is just as true for religious movements of rage as it is for secular movements of rage. And all of them focus on this notion of cultural corruption, that the pure society has been corrupted from the outside and usually from some sort of fifth column within. Again, the educated elite typically is the focus of this this corruption. Now, global jihad being global, it's not a national. The other examples I'm giving you are national movements of rage. Global jihad basically takes the same set of characteristics and applies it globally, as opposed to just in the local country. And so I discuss that at some length in my book and what that means. As I said at the outset, there's a number of other examples. Ones I gave earlier: the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, the Red Guards in China, the Brown Shirts as part of the Nazi coalition in the 1930s before they were essentially purged out of the coalition. And I would suggest elements of the white nationalist or white supremacist movement that you see in the world today. So with that, I conclude my talk. Again, if you're interested in getting the book and reading all the details, that should be available in November. You can pre-order it now, as you can see. Again, Stanford University Press. Thank you very much for spending a few minutes with me this afternoon. I hope you've learned something interesting, kind of a way to think about global jihad, away from just the newspaper headlines. And I invite you again, if you'd like to participate in a moderated discussion of this talk, email us, let us know. And then on the 30th of this month, Dr. Craig Whiteside will be giving a talk on ISIS. And again, every 2 weeks on the 15th and 30th of each month, at least through October. And we'll see where we stand at that point. But at least through October, we'll be doing these quick takes twice a month. And we encourage you to sign up so you can get them directly in your inbox. And you just have to click on the link and it'll take you right to the talk. In the meantime, everybody, please stay healthy, stay well. I wish you the best. Thank you very much.